Our next speaker is Julian Yarko, and the title of his talk is Breaking Taboos in Fair Machine Learning, an Experimental Study. Julian, you can go right ahead.
Thanks, everyone, for being here at this talk. So this is co-authored work with Sharat Goel and Rosanna Sommers. And in our project, we really want to sort of wrestle with some of the normative and ethical considerations behind much of algorithmic decision making. And we are focusing in our context on risk assessment tools. And just a brief primer, so risk assessment tools are used throughout the US, especially in criminal justice proceedings, to determine some adverse outcome for defendants. The typical outcomes we're trying to predict are recidivism risk or the failure to appear. And there's sort of a discussion about the type of features that should go into these algorithms, and in particular, whether it should be permissible to use so-called protected features, which are features that sort of have a higher level of protection under anti-discrimination laws, such as race and gender. And among the general public and lawyers in particular, there's sort of this view that the inclusion of these characteristics, these protected features, is taboo, right? And even in the CS literature, even in sort of the fairness through awareness literature, we see some hesitation and some wrestling with whether it should be permitted to use these types of features. For instance, some people say they should be limited to training processes, but not to the prediction stage. And so in this project, we really want to ask why there is this hesitation and why there's this general sense that protected features shouldn't be used. Now, to give you just, so in principle, there are different modes of ethical reasoning, and two of the most prominent ones are consequentialism and deontology. And so consequentialism really says we should judge an action or policy based on the outcomes it leads to. It's a bad action if it produces bad outcomes. And that notion is sort of encapsulated in this quote here by Eric Holder, who says that basing sentencing decisions on static factors and immutable characteristics such as race may exacerbate unwarranted and unjust disparities that are already far too common in our criminal justice system and in our society. So again, the basic idea being here, we shouldn't use those characteristics in making decisions because it tends to harm, right, marginalized groups. But there's a second notion of morality and moral actions, which says, irrespective of the outcomes, an action can be good or bad based on a value system that is sort of orthogonal to outcomes. And that is encapsulated here in this quote by Justice White in Missouri v. Jenkins, who said that policies shouldn't be explicitly dependent on, let's say, race, because the government must treat citizens as individuals and not as members of racial, ethnic, and religious groups. And you see this sentiment reflected in much of sort of the legal literature, which is, we don't care so much about outcomes. It's just wrong to make a decision in an individual case based on their group membership, right? So for instance, it's just wrong to have a Black defendant put them or detain them because other Black defendants had a high recidivism risk, right? Or similarly, to release more Black defendants because other Black defendants tend to have a lower risk of recidivism. And so consequentialist and sort of deontological notions of morality quite often point in the same direction, but not always. And sort of one classic example is the use of gender and risk assessment tools, right? So in current risk assessment tools, we know that given a certain risk score, female defendants tend to have a lower rate of recidivism than male defendants. And so if we allow the algorithm to see gender, right, and specifically include gender as a feature, it can take that into account and in fact, release more female defendants. Similarly, we have in over-policing, so there's a similar story in sort of the risk assessment tools for Black defendants. So in some areas of the United States, we have a lot of over-policing, which means that many Black people have a criminal record. And a criminal record figures very prominently in risk assessment tools because it tends to be quite predictive of recidivism risk. But, right, if we sort of allow the algorithm to see race, then it would be able to figure out that in some areas, right, criminal history is not predictive for Black people. And so it might detain fewer Black people or suggest detention for fewer Black people because it is able to distinguish the importance of the criminal record for the prediction of the different subgroups. And so here you can see that consequentialists, right, would say, well, this is, you have shown me that the inclusion of protected features actually makes things better for the group I'm trying to protect. So maybe we should use protected features. Whereas a deontologist would say, I don't care about outcomes, right? As a matter of principle, because it's just wrong to make decisions in that way, we should continue to blind algorithms in this way. And so this is really what we're trying to tease out here, whether the hesitation to the use of protected features is sort of fueled by deontological concerns, or whether it is really about consequentialism, whether it's a useful heuristic to try to protect marginalized groups. We conduct a survey experiment in which we have represented a sample of the US population. It's representative with respect to sex, race, and ethnicity. We do two separate survey experiments, one on computer scientists, one on practicing lawyers, as the ones who sort of deal most frequently with these questions of algorithmic discrimination. And so our experimental design is pretty straightforward. So it's a three-step process. And the first step, we explain to our participants what risk assessment tools are. We explain to them in particular what a race-blind and a race-tailored tool is. And I should note, in the paper, we do something similar with gender, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on race here. Then we're going to manipulate the outcomes under the race-tailored tool. And in a final step, we're going to determine people's preference, stated preference for the race-tailored tool. And the idea here is simply that if people's preferences are sensitive to the outcomes under the race-tailored tool, it means that they care about outcomes and they're at least in part motivated by consequentialist concerns. Whereas if responses are largely invariant to the outcomes under the race-tailored tool, it would suggest that people are have deontological priors and just as a matter of principle don't want the use of protected features. Now, before we sort of dive into the conditions that we have, we can look at the control conditions. So here we just explain to people what risk assessment tools are, and we say, okay, your state is considering the use of some risk assessment tool. Do you want the race blind or the race specific tool, right? And so here you can see the results. So over 90% of respondents say they prefer the race blind tool, right? And only a small minority says they prefer the race specific tool. And if we look at the open text responses for why that preference exists, it typically is put forth that it would be the morally right thing to do, sort of this deontological concern, right? Deliberately making a tool that's racially based is biased and wrong, or another quote, using race as a factor to determine whether someone is deemed dangerous or not is morally wrong. So it seems like if you just ask people, the reason for their aversion to the use of protected characteristics is sort of a matter of principle, right? But then we have this minimal sort of treatment condition here, where we provide respondents with basically a small blurb of information that I also presented previously, which is sort of this idea that due to over-policing, criminal record matters less for some Black defendants. And so in those areas, we might want to use race because if it can improve outcomes, right? And this is sort of, we say this is what some researchers argue. And then to people who have been assigned to this what we call general context condition, we again ask them about their preferences on these tools. And what we find is the following. So we see a significant shift towards the approval of race-specific tools, right? Just by making people aware of the abstract possibility that their preference for, or that a preference for blinding can actually harm the people we're trying to protect. And so in the general population and among computer scientists and lawyers, we see sort of a pretty significant shift towards the approval or preference for race-specific, race-tailored tools. And for the general population and lawyers, that the preference is indistinguishable from zero at traditional levels of significance here. Now, if we look at the reasons they provide for their preference, we see that the reason giving also switches, right? Whereas before it was sort of deontological, oh, it's as a matter of principle wrong to use protected features. Now there's much more talk about precision and accuracy and outcomes, right? So one quote says, I think including the race-specific criteria will help the algorithm make more accurate predictions, and the teller tool will compensate for racial inequality and do a better job at predicting those who pose a risk, right? And so both the preference changes and the mode of reason giving changes after this minimal treatment. And then we have a specific context, what we call a specific context condition. So here we present people with actual numbers. So under the race blind tool, we always say 50% of Black and white defendants are released. And then we vary the proportion of Black and white defendants released under the Taylor tool. So we say, for instance, 70 versus 30%, 55, 45, 50, 50, 45, 55, and 30, 70. And so then we again ask people, do you want the race blind tool or the race specific tool? And what we see is a general increase, again, in the acceptance of the race-specific tool, dependent on the fraction of Black defendants that are released under the race-specific tool. Interestingly, we never reach sort of the same approval rating that we get under the general context condition, which you see as a horizontal dashed line here. And we assume this is because it's just the general context condition is providing a specific example and sort of is really graspable, whereas people are not swayed as much by abstract data. But this is sort of a somewhat open question. Now, in summary, we find that most people have a strong stated preference for blinding risk assessment tools to race. The stated reasoning, if you just ask them, is primarily deontological, but at the same time, they're also highly susceptible to outcomes, right? And we view them as sort of hidden consequentialists, people who care about outcomes, but if you just ask them, they wouldn't state that they care about outcomes in this way. Now, what's the relevance? So first of all, we have to reinforce the notion or the finding that blinding can be useful in many areas, right? It can be a useful default. Marginalized groups are very often harmed by the inclusion of protected features, for instance, in automatic credit risk assessments. And if we have an adversarial actor, right, blinding to race might, for instance, offer some protection against abuse. We know it doesn't offer very good protection, but at least some. However, if it can be shown that the inclusion of protected features might actually improve outcomes for the marginalized group, then we can get a lot of approval for, or at least a significant shift in approval for these race-specific tailoring. And the rhetoric we would see from opponents of algorithmic decision-making that includes protected features is a poor guide, because everyone says their preferences are deontologically motivated, when in fact they might not be. And so one of the most natural policy implications that might flow from this is that we might be able to pretest our algorithms. We might be able to pretest a blind versus a tailored algorithm for the impact on the marginalized group. And we might permit the use of the tailored algorithm if it actually provides better outcomes for the group we're trying to protect. This would be a form of sort of algorithmic affirmative action. And in the full paper, oh, I have so much time left. Well, in the full paper, we're walking through different potential legal constraints of doing so. In our view, the legal landscape is not fully clear. So many point to the Ricky or Ritchie decision as saying that pretesting algorithm in this way would actually not be permitted. Our view is that it's unclear whether it could be permitted. And so here we are saying that basically this pretesting procedure might be both politically feasible and potentially legally available solution. Okay, and with that, maybe the last couple of minutes give me more time to ask or answer questions. Thank you.
Looks like there's a question from Jose. If you want to read it and answer it, go for it.
Are there some general conditions under which blindness is preferred? So we think that that determination should be made primarily based on the outcomes. So basically looking at just comparing outcomes under treated versus tailored tool and then making the decision. But it's probably helpful to think more, which we sort of haven't done in this project, about whether there are sort of more analytical conditions, for instance, under which we can make predictions about when the blind tool might be preferable over the tailored tool.